So I want to talk to you today about some of the kinds of cultural outcomes or consequences that may result from your involvement in activism or more generally from a social movement. One of the first things that people think about when they think about cultural outcomes is change to public opinion. So often social movements are trying as a part of getting a policy or some other practice to be common or adopted, they try to get people to change their view on that. It turns out, though, that social movements have a complicated relationship to public opinion. Research shows that social movements are very effective at raising the salience of an issue, which means that movements are very effective at getting people to think more about any particular issue. Unfortunately, research is much more mixed about whether or not movements can be effective at getting people to change their opinion once they already have an opinion on an issue. So for instance, a movement may, like the pro-choice, pro-life debate, those two movements may be very effective at getting individuals to think about abortion politics in the United States, but they're often much less effective at getting people to change their mind once they already have an opinion about whether they support abortion access or not. There's also controversy about whether or not movements actually need public opinion to already be in their favor in order to have policy success. And there's some evidence that certainly movements thrive in environments where public opinion is already favorable. It's less clear whether or not movements can create that favorable public opinion and then take advantage of it. A second kind of cultural consequence is really about the kinds of cultural products, phrases, language that's around us in everyday life. So let me give you a couple examples of prominent cultural outcomes of prior movements. The diffusion of genes was something that resulted from the civil rights movement. Think of any number of symbols like the rainbow flag for LGBTQ activism. If we were thinking historically, we might think about classic images of suffragettes or of civil rights activists. We might think about language change. So there are certainly racial epitaphs that people no longer consider acceptable to use, and you could find the same thing in other movements. There's also new language that comes into being. So we now often talk about rape survivors as opposed to rape victims. All of these changes in cultural products, language, the way that we interact with one another, we could think about as cultural outcomes. Now, while it's often the case that people intend to have consequences in terms of public opinion, where we think about these kinds of everyday cultural consequences of activism, sometimes those are intended, like changes in language, for instance, from victim to survivor, was a very conscious move by the feminist movement. But other kinds of changes, like the diffusion of genes across college campuses, was not an intentional outcome of a social movement, but happened nonetheless. A third kind of outcome that we could think about are cultural is probably less relevant to your movement, which is changes in overall worldviews. Now, in this kind of change, people literally come to think about their world in entirely different ways. Now, that doesn't mean that this doesn't happen. So for instance, someone who really takes on a radically different understanding about the position of animals in their life as a result of their participation in the animal rights movement may affect lots of ways that they think about things and do things. They may become vegans, they may be much more conscientious about the products they buy and how those are sourced and how they're related to animals, etc. But for most people, movements don't result in whole-scale changes in their overall worldview. They result in one of the other two kinds of consequences, a raising of salience of public opinion about an issue, or changes in language, everyday interaction, the kinds of symbols that they recognize and might even use. Now, I would encourage you to think about cultural consequences as a potentially very important thing that your movement could work on. Imagine what it would have been like to try to organize as an LGBT movement without some of the symbols that let you know that this was a gay bookstore or a gay-friendly bar. Those were important signaling devices that helped open up public space for that movement to come together. If you also think about changes in language, the change from talking about victims to survivors is a really impactful change in a lot of women and some men's lives. And so, although it's common for movements to be very focused on policy outcomes or political outcomes, I want to encourage you to think about the possibility that your actions could have real cultural outcomes that matter in the lives of other people. Good luck.